phenomenon that I've studied, and they seem to be becoming dominant in the literature. So this work started by Helen Block Lewis and then rapidly elaborated upon by June Price Tangany and her colleagues, talks about guilt and shame as self-conscious moral emotions. So there are things that you're judging about yourself, and guilt here is, look what I did. It's focused on an action, whereas shame is focused on a self-assessment of your entire self. So shame is about I, as a whole, am a bad person. Guilt is about, well, I did one thing that was problematic. Now, in this schema, based on extensive studies of people's journaling, self-reporting, and other types of measures, they found a couple of things. One, that guilt tends to be much more short-term than shame. And two, I think very significantly, if we're talking about environmentalism, that guilt tends to prompt people to take action. If you recognize that you have done something that's against your moral codes and it's an action, you're more likely to say you're sorry, to try to restore a relationship with the one that you've harmed, repay someone, or have some compromise in the future. Whereas if you've done something that you think reveals something horrible about yourself, feeling shame, then you're more likely to want to hide or withdraw, to cover your face, to try to reject the fact that you did anything wrong, or to justify your actions in some way. Shame also tends to lead to anger. So as you might expect, people who are feeling this deep shame aren't very likely to compromise, to want to put together rules or laws to change action, or to do any sort of restoration or reparative work based on what they've done in the past. Now, while I really like this differentiation, I think, I should say first, it does hold with respect to responses to environmental actions. I've done some work where I've looked at online conversations about environmental guilt and shame, and I found that they really map onto this dichotomy, that some people are very much focused on a particular action. I keep forgetting my cloth bags when I go to the grocery store. What can I do about it? You want a concrete action. But most of the dialogues that I looked at online are really dealing with shame. As people are saying, I forgot my canvas bags at the store. Why do I keep doing this? The action provokes an existential reflection in the person as they wonder about themselves and really all of human nature. If I can't even get this one little thing right, how can I hope to have any sort of significant impact? So I like this differentiation. It really seems to map onto the literature and what I'm seeing in a whole host of cultural experience. But there is a really big problem with this. Namely, it's incredibly individualistic. Most all of the research about these definitions of guilt and shame have focused on very localized, individualized actions. Someone cheating on a test, someone lying to their parents. And yeah, those are good things to study. But when I look at the literature, when I hear people talk about their environmental activities, I see much more of a sense of collective guilt and collective shame. And I started thinking about this for a couple of reasons. One, because I see it in the literature. Two, because I'm not convinced that our identities are so incredibly separated from other people. I think that they shape who we are and we shape who they are. And third, because I've been reading literature in post-Holocaust studies about the collective guilt that Germans felt, and the collective guilt that people have been feeling all over the world for atrocities that their in-group, whether their national group or their ethnic group or religious group or cultural group, perpetrated against someone else. And it seems that worldwide, not everybody, but a significant number of groups of people have been feeling this collective guilt in the last 60 or 70 years, reflecting upon it and actually doing things to apologize, to make reparations. And I will argue that this type of collective guilt is also present in the environmental movement and can have significant ramifications for action. Now, collective guilt happens when you have a couple of conditions. One, when you identify with the group. Two, when you judge that that group as a whole or particular individuals within that group have done something wrong. And three, when you make the leap from this group identity and this judgment of wrong to then a judgment that you yourself are culpable in some sort of way, and then bad feelings emerge. Now, what's interesting about these historical studies of collective guilt, or one of the interesting things, is that this is often felt when people did not actually physically or directly participate in the problematic action. Maybe they weren't alive at that time. Maybe they didn't know all of the details of what was happening. But they're still feeling collective guilt, or in some cases, collective shame. I think that this is really an important piece of the puzzle, intellectually speaking, because often environmental philosophers have wanted a direct link between an individual cause and an individual harm. And in climate change, it's very difficult to say, oh, well, I'm using this computer and that is using electricity that comes from a particular power plant and has particular emissions that then are harming a particular person. You just can't draw that causal link. And because you can't draw that causal link, some people are very confused or not certain about whether you can actually have some kind of responsibility. And I think that the moral emotions of people here are indicating that even if there's not this direct causal link, you can have this sort of responsibility. So I'd like to argue that collective guilt and collective shame map onto this typology of individual guilt and shame. That collective guilt is about, look what we did, the particular action, whereas collective shame is, look what we did, judging that the community, the nation, the ethnic group as a whole, or maybe Westerners or people in general are problematic. Following the typology even further, collective guilt is the sort of thing that leads to reparations or apologies, whereas collective shame, you're trying to avoid the problem, you're denying that it exists, you're blaming the victim, you're running away, you're doing all of these sorts of things. If this is actually occurring in the environmental movement, or if it will be more in the future as people internalize their own culpability for environmental problems, I think that then this can have major ramifications for how people deal with environmental problems. Now, if we look at this book, Confessions of an Eco-Sinner, we see some examples of this collective shame and guilt. Peers, like many environmentalists, are concerned with changing their own day-to-day habits, but describe their motivation as coming from the recognition of the collective impact of their group. Sometimes this recognition is about the effects of their nation on the climate. Other times it's about Westerners or developed nations or people in general. He in particular writes, if Westerners like me had carbon emissions like that of the average Chinese, there would be no climate change problem right now. Elsewhere in the book, he talks at length about the guilt he feels about the environmental effects of his day-to-day actions and the effects of those on the workers that produce products or on the biosphere in general. So I'm arguing that Peirce and many other people identify with a larger problem and see themselves as guilty for what has happened in the past, maybe decisions they didn't directly participate in, though they may have benefited from them in some way. And I think that this identification with the collective and prioritization of standards that have been violated is what can spark the guilt and in some cases the urge to do something. So he, for example, felt this emotion and wrote a book trying to get people to change their activities. Now, unfortunately, the relationship of environmental guilt and environmental action hasn't been studied very much in any sort of rigorous empirical way. One study that I've been able to find by Mark Ferguson and Nyla Branscombe found that those who feel collective guilt for climate change were more likely to be willing to engage in mitigation efforts, such as conserving energy or being willing to pay green taxes. So it bears out this connection between guilt and action. They say this isn't surprising because for people to have guilt, they need to think they're responsible for something and think that it's possible to change. Environmental shame, on the other hand, I have not been able to find any such empirical studies linking these things together. But what I've found from my survey of many different books, looking at a lot, thousands of online conversations about environmental guilt, is that I think collective environmental shame is also happening. People are talking about the failure to live up to their environmental ideals. They're judging themselves and their community to be problematic, and they're trying to deal with these existential and moral problems as well as the physical or communal. I would also argue that judgments about the human community as a whole run throughout a lot of environmental literature, as you see people hinting about, well, maybe it would be better if humans just didn't exist, that we are such a problem as a species that there's some reason to think the world might be a better place without us. These emotions, not surprisingly, are often tied to feelings of despair, or despondency, or paralysis. How could we ever actually take action if we are so much the problem? And I think they can be connected to denials of the problem as well. So I would argue that quite obviously such negative self and group assessments pose some radical changes to environmentalism as a whole. One, well, guilt could potentially motivate action because the problem is seen as related to a particular solvable past action, not one's whole self. I would argue that the logic of shame undercuts hope for change. That if people are deep down horrible or bad or problematic, then there's no real hope of doing anything better. And so why even try? I think that this logic of shame undercuts any possibility of seeing real action at a governmental level, at an individual level. And I think that this can have really significant ramifications then for environmental policy making and action. I would also argue that thinking about guilt and shame calls attention to the fact that knowing what we're supposed to do or thinking that we know what we're supposed to do isn't really the whole solution. It's not all about knowledge, it's also about action and our sense of self, our vision of who humans are individually and collectively, of dealing with these existential and ethical issues. So as I was remarking to a couple of people last night at supper, I think that part of the issue is being able to re-envision our religious or philosophical worldviews to be able to take account of these issues. And that often in today's world, the old worldviews haven't been rethought in enough depth to deal with contemporary issues like climate change or energy use. For those people who are within those worldviews, and for those people that are outside of those worldviews, there's not a robust enough system to deal with the hope of change and the potential failures or limitations of being human. So this is one area that I think that humanities can really bring to thoughts about energy use and climate change. Thanks.